السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله على إحسانه وشكر له على تفضله وامتنانه، ولا إله إلا الله تعظيما لشأنه، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله داعي إلى رضوانه، وعلى آله وأصحابه وإخوانه. أما بعد، يقول ربنا سبحانه وتعالى في محكم الآيات:
اتقوا ربكم إن زلزلة الساعة شيء عظيم يوم ترونها تذهل كل مرضعة عما أرضعت وتضع كل ذات حملها وترى الناس سكارى وما هم بسكارى ولكن عذاب الله شديد.
إخواني في الله, we are continuing our lecture series regarding the day of judgment, the day of resurrection. This day, Ikhwani fi Allah, is the most terrifying day in our entire lives. This is a day of fear, a day of torment, a day none of us can imagine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is great. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes this day as being a very great day, a very terrifying day, a very difficult day. If this is a description of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the greatest, what will be our feelings on that day? How shall we describe that day that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes as a great day? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, أَلَا يَظُنُّ أُولَٰئِكَ أَنَّهُمْ مَبْعُوثُونَ لِيَوْمٍ عَظِيمٍ يَوْمَ يَقُومُ النَّاسُ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Do they not think these people, they shall be resurrected on a day that is very great? The day people will be standing before the Lord of the worlds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls this day Yawmun Azim, a great day. This is also a day Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls a heavy day, a difficult day, a day that you're not able to contemplate. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّ هَؤُلَاءِ يُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَةِ وَيَذَرُونَ وَرَاءَهُمْ يَوْمًا ثَقِيلًا. These people that you look at, they love this life of this world that is a quick life, a life that will end. And they leave behind, they neglect a day that is a heavy day, a difficult day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَذَلِكَ يَوْمَئِذٍ يَوْمٌ عَسِيرٌ عَلَى الْكَافِرِينَ غَيْرُ يَسِيرٌ. He says that day is a very difficult day for all of us. But for the disbelievers, it is even more so difficult. Ikhwani fillah, point number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this day as difficult, this day as heavy, this day as a great tormenting day. It is definitely like that. Number two, on this day, ikhwani fillah, the parent will forget that they are a parent. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, fear Allah. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم إن زلزلة الساعة شيء عظيم. Indeed, the earthquake, the tremor of the day of judgment is something terrifying. يوم ترونها تذهل كل مرضعة عما أرضعت وتضع كل ذات حملها وترى الناس السكارى وما هم بالسكارى ولكن عذاب الله شديد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says on that day, the mother who is looking after the child, breastfeeding the child, she will forget about the child on that day. Today it's no child, it's myself. And the woman who is pregnant, she will give birth prematurely, before the due date. And you shall see the people walking on the day of judgment as if they are drunkards. But they are not drunkards. The punishment of that day is severe. I had a conversation, Ikhwani fillah, with some of my staff, non-Muslims. And I was surprised at how the parent is such an amazing person. These people are not Muslims. They get 25,000 shillings, 30,000 shillings per month. But most of their salary, they are living for their children. That is the parent, Muslim or non-Muslim. Leave even the human beings. How many times have we seen documentaries of elephants when their child is in distress, they are ready to sacrifice their own self to save the child? We have seen it with giraffes, we have seen it with elephants, we have seen it even with the chicken. They are ready to fight a person 50 times their size to protect their kids. But on that day of judgment, ikhwani fillah, there is no family. No one cares about their family. Everyone is nafsi, nafsi. So much so that the woman who is breastfeeding, whose life is for her child, that day she does not even care about her child. That day is the day of Qiyamah. That day is a difficult day, ikhwani fillah. People will be looking up. They will not blink a single bit. And as we mentioned in the previous lecture, people will be resurrected, the men and the women. All of them are naked, but no one will be looking left or right. They shall be looking up. They shall be looking without blinking a single bit. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ اللَّهَ غَافِلًا عَمَّا يَعْمَلُ الظَّالِمُونَ إِنَّمَا يُؤَخِّرُهُمْ لِيَوْمٍ تَشْخَصُ فِيهِ الْأَبْصَارُ مُهْطِعِينَ مُقْنِعِي رُؤُوسِهِمْ لَا يَرْتَدُّ إِلَيْهِمْ طَرْفُهُمْ وَأَفِئِدَتُهُمْ هَوَاءٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not assume that these people who are committing crimes in this dunya, that they are harming the innocents. Do not assume that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will neglect them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is delaying them for a day where their eyes will not come back down. Their eyes will not blink. They will not look right or left. مُهْضِعِينَ, they will rush to their Lord. مُقْنِعِي رُؤُوسِهِمْ, raising their heads. لَا تَرْتَدُّ إِلَيْهِمْ طَرْفُهُمْ. Their blinking will not come back. Their eyes will be agaze in fear, in a nightmare. When is this nightmare going to end? This is the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that that day is so difficult for the oppressors that their hearts will reach their throats, but they will not come. Their soul will not come out. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنذِرْهُمْ يَوْمَ الْآزِفَةِ إِذِ الْقُلُوبُ لَدَى الْحَنَاجِرِ كَاظِمِينَ. And warn them the day of the screaming, the day of the shout, when their soul will reach the throat and they will not come out. Ikhwani fillah, this is the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا تَتَقَلَّبُ فِيهِ الْقُلُوبُ وَالْأَبْصَارُ. The believers, they fear a day where their hearts and their eyes will be stared, will be fixated in fear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلُوبٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ وَاجِفَةٌ أَبْصَارُهَا خَاشِعَةٌ. Ikhwani fillah, on that day, a child, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, because of the horrifying nature of the day of judgment, their hair will turn grey. Their hair will turn white, like a person who was aged in a single day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَكَيْفَ تَتَّقُونَ إِن كَفَرْتُمْ يَوْمًا يَجْعَلُ الْوِلْدَانَ شِيبًا. And how will you not fear a day where that young child will become a gray-haired old man? Point number 2, ikhwani fillah, the day of judgment is so scary that people will be forgetting even their own children. They will be in a state of intoxication, yet they are not intoxicated. Their eyes will be fixated to the heavens, not looking left or right, and their hearts in their throats because of the fearful nature of that day. Point number 3, on the day of judgment, ikhwani fillah, there's no family. There's no Baba, there's no Mama, there's no my dear beloved son, there's no my dear beloved daughter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَإِذَا نُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ فَلَا أَنْسَابَ بَيْنَهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ وَلَا يَتَسَاءَلُونَ. When the trumpet is blown for the second time by Israfil alayhi salam, there's no longer family ties. There's no longer you're a Kenyan. There's no longer you're a Somali. There's no longer you're the family of Muhammad, Isa, Fulan and Fulan. No family ties, no tribal ties, no nationality ties. Nafsi, nafsi, it is myself, it is myself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says on that day, a person will run away from their brother, from their mother, from their father, from their wives, from their children. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الصَّاخَّةُ يَوْمَ يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ وَأُمِّهِ وَأَبِيهِ وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَبَنِيهِ لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مِّنْهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ شَأْنٌ يُغْنِيهِ. On that day, Ikhwani fillah, the day of the scream, the day of the shouting, every person will run away from their brother. This brother you are expecting in a battle, the enemy is approaching you, expecting your brothers to stand firm with you. But on the day of judgment, no one is backing you up. You have no brothers on that day. وَأُمِّهِ وَأَبِيهِ. Your mother, your father, no one is there to support you. وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَبَنِيهِ. Your dutiful wife, your beautiful wife who stood with you when you were poor until you became rich and lived with you 30, 40, 50 years. She loves you dearly. On that day, she wants none of your business. Your children that you paid the education, all the food, everything. You spent your life savings on them for them to get somewhere, for them at least to benefit you in this dunya and akhirah. On that day, they do not want any part to do with you. It is nafsi, it is nafsi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nasu attaqu rabbakum wakhshaw yawman la yajzi walidun an waladihi wa la mawludun huwa jazin an walidihi shay'a inna wa'da Allahi haqq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, wattaqu yawman لا تجزي نفس عن نفس شيئا ولا يقبل منها الشفاعة ولا يؤخذ منها عدل ولا هم ينصرون. Point number 3, Ikhwani fillah, on the day of judgment, there is no family, there is no relation. It is me and myself and my deeds. Keep away from me, dad. Keep away from me, mom. My children, keep away from me. Point number 4, Ikhwani fillah, on the day of judgment, when that disbeliever who has a very difficult day on that day, if he was given the option of owning this entire world and its wealth to free themselves from the torment of that day, they shall pay every single cent that they can possibly own in this dunya. If they were to own this entire world with its entire GDP, they'll be able to ransom themselves. The current GDP, this is the size of economies in the entire world, is about $100 trillion. $103 trillion as of this year. So if someone was owning all this GDP, he's ready on the day of judgment, oh Allah, take this money, $103 trillion. Kenya shillings, I don't even know how to say it. It will be 10 quadrillion Kenya shillings. Oh Allah, take this so that I do not be going through this day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَوْ أَنَّ لِكُلِّ نَفْسٍ ظَلَمَتْ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ لَافْتَدَتْ بِهِ. If every soul that harmed themselves was able to ransom themselves, pay off Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment, they shall pay off with the dunya and everything in it. Number 2, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if the kafir, if the person who's wronged themselves in this dunya, if they're able to pay double or triple or more than that, they shall pay it. I said the current GDP of the world is about $100 trillion. If you're to double that, it's about 100, maybe $6 trillion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ لَمْ يَسْتَجِيبُوا لَهُ لَوْ أَنَّ لَهُ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا وَمِثْلَهُ مَعَهُ لَافْتَدَوْا بِهِ أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ سُوءُ الْحِسَابِ. For the person whose calls will not be answered by Allah Azza wa Jal, if he owned this entire world and double of it in terms of wealth to ransom themselves, they will ransom themselves. But for them is a painful account, for them is a painful punishment on the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to us also, imagine this entire world, the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, that is the air. Imagine the water, all the liquid in this dunya. Imagine all the solid, the rocks, the hills, all the solid, the carbon, every single thing from the elements are gold. Imagine this entire world is gold. The person on the day of judgment is ready to give this world in its weight in gold to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Oh Allah, do not punish me. Allow me to be saved from this day. That is the tormenting nature of the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَمَاتُوا وَهُمْ كُفَّارٌ فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْ أَحَدِهِمْ مِلْءُ الْأَرْضِ ذَهَبًا وَلَوْ افتدى بِهِ أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ وَمَا لَهُم مِّن نَاصِرِينَ. Indeed, the ones who disbelieved and they died as disbelievers, it will not be accepted from any of them the weight of this world in gold, even if they were to ransom themselves with it. For them is a painful punishment, and they do not have anyone who will save them. The Prophet ﷺ, he says on the day of judgment, the disbeliever will be brought before Allah Azza wa Jal. And he say to him, أَرَأَيْتَ لَوْ كَانَ لَكَ مِثْلَ أَرْضِ ذَهَبًا أَكُنْتَ تَفْتَدِي بِهِ. Do you see, if you give you the entire weight of this world in gold, take this wealth, are you going to ransom yourself? Are you going to pay your cash bail from the day of judgment with this entire earth weight of gold to save yourself from this predicament of the day of judgment? The Prophet ﷺ, he says, the person will say, Na'am. And then it will be said to him, قَدْ كُنْتَ سَأَلْتُكَ مَا هُوَ أَيْسَرُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. I only requested from you something that was much less than that. The only thing I requested from you as your Lord, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was La ilaha illallah, and for you to live upon it. I requested from you not to worship except me, and not to associate partners with me. Now on this day, you think you can ransom yourself. You think you can escape from the torment of this day with money. What am I to do with money? And I'm your Lord, I am your creator. This is not part of the hadith. Yet for me is all the kingdom, all the dominion. What are you going to benefit me? And I'm the King of Kings. I am Al-Ghani. I am the wealthiest, free of any need. How then do you think that this money is going to compromise me in any way? Yet I warned you, O my servant. Ikhwani fillah, this day, the kafir, he does not care. He wants to save himself at any cost, even if he throws his mother to the hellfire. Oh, mom, go to the hellfire. Will that save him? No. Dad, you join mom in the hellfire. Will that save him? No. Oh, mom, dad, you're joined by all my children and all my wives and all my siblings, hellfire. Benefit? No. My entire tribe, take my entire tribe, throw them in my hellfire. My national, the people of my country, throw them in the hellfire to save myself. He's ready to do all that because of the torment of the day of judgment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, يَوَدُّ الْمُجْرِمُ لَوْ يَفْتَدِي مِنْ عَذَابِ يَوْمِئِذٍ بِبَنِيهِ. The evil person on that day, he wishes to ransom himself with his children, his sons and his daughters. وَصَاحِبَتِهِ, his wife. وَأَخِيهِ, his siblings. وَفَصِيلَتِهِ الَّتِي تُؤْوِيهِ, his tribe that protects him. وَمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا, and everyone on the earth. So after he finishes his tribe, his country, he says, Oh Allah, 7 billion people on earth, throw them in the hellfire, save myself. He's ready to sacrifice all those people for himself. For he can see the horrifying nature, the terror that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prepared for him on that day of judgment. Ikhwani fillah, finally, to describe the day of judgment and to show how horrifying it is, we have lived in this world for how long? The oldest person I can see in the mosque is probably 70 years old. The day of judgment, ikhwani fillah, is equivalent. One day is one day, which is equivalent to how many years? 50,000 years. If you're 70 years old, just to comprehend mathematics, it's good to work with maths. 70 years old. How I die when I'm 70? Fair enough? If I was to live for 50,000 years, 50,000 years compared to 70 is me living a life of 70 years, dying, living a second life, dying, and continuing like that at least 700 plus times. 700 times 70 is 49,000, I believe. So over 700 times you have lived this sequence of life. The old men here, they say 70 years. how long was 70 years? Just before independence of this country. They think that is far. Now imagine on the day of Qiyamah, you've been standing for a day that is equivalent to 50,000 years. How does that compare to these 70 years that you've been given in this world? This shows that this is a terrifying day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تَعْرُجُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَالرُّوحُ إِلَيْهِ فِي يَوْمٍ كَانَ مِقْدَارُهُ 50 ألف سنة فاصبر صبرا جميلا إنهم يرونه بعيدا ونراه قريبا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this day is equivalent to 50,000 years. So be patient, a good patience. They see it as very far. The disbelievers see this day as very far. But we see it as very close. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَأَنَّهُمْ يَوْمَ يَرَوْنَهَا لَمْ يَلْبَثُوا إِلَّا عَشِيَّةً أَوْ ضُحَاهَا. The people, when they see this day of judgment and how long it is, they say the life of the world we lived was like just duha. The time of duha, the sleep we had at duha, or the night. It was, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُقْسِمُ الْمُجْرِمُونَ مَا لَبِثُوا غَيْرَ سَاعَةٍ. The disbelievers, the evil people will say, Wallahi, we live in this world in comparison to this day of judgment for 1 hour. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَالَ كَمْ لَبِثْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ عَدَدَ السِّنِينَ قَالُوا لَبِثْنَا يَوْمًا أَوْ بَعْدَ يَوْمٍ. The person will be asked on the day of judgment, how long were you in this world for? Give us the time. How long? Compare the day of judgment. He says, it was maybe a day, 2. No, it was part of a day. In comparison to the day of judgment, it was part of a day. Ikhwani fillah, this shows to us the day of judgment is a difficult day. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us thabat on that day. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst the people who are given the shade on the day there is no shade other than the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to honor us and our families and our loved ones and our children on the day of judgment. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us a throne next to him مع الذين أنعم الله عليهم من النبيين والصديقين والشهداء والصالحين. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to raise our levels in this world and the hereafter. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على طاعتك. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.